I'd like you to imagine the following situation. You've arrived home. You've had a particularly challenging day. You're tired, you're irritable, and to make matters worse, you've now got all the pressures that come with being at home, prepping meals, housework, childcare. By the time everything's done, you've had enough. You're knackered. You want to take the stress away. So what do you turn to? What's your source of comfort? Well, you've got plenty of choices. A recent Reddit poll collated over 30 possible rewards, and as you can see, I've put some of them up here on the board. Now, while all of these sound good, what happens when these things go from being comforts to being requirements? What happens when we begin to self-medicate, using substances to address, or even worse, suppress, the symptoms of our mental or our physical difficulties? Now, the delineation between the two can often be quite murky. As such, estimates of self-medication rates range between 35 and 94% of the worldwide adult population. This depends on the location, with the most common substances for self-medication being alcohol, cigarettes, and then prescribed or prohibited drugs. And remember, this is amongst the civilian population. Just think about rates of self-medication amongst soldiers in wartime. As an officer in the Lancaster Fusiliers, Tolkien would have seen men seeking solace in substances, especially amidst the horrors of the Somme. And unless we forget, Tolkien refers to his work as the History of the Great War of the Ring in his foreword to the second edition. Based on these two premises, I entered this research with a simple question. Do combatants use substances to bolster their courage in Tolkien's Legendarium? Now, the answers I found touch on issues of strength, social connection, and spirituality. And today, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share them with you. And let's begin by having a quick look at the links between pharmacology and conflict. On a purely biological level, war is completely inimical to our instincts for self-preservation. This is especially true when combatants face danger for the benefits of others, say a loved one, a comrade, or for abstract notions like patriotism. So why do it? Well, broadly speaking, combat motivation falls into four areas: fear of being punished by your superiors if you disobey orders, shame at letting down your fellow soldiers, anger directed towards an enemy, and enthusiasm for a cause that makes them willing to take risks. Now, these are all coherent motivations, and they've been responsible for feats of incredible bravery over the centuries. The problem is that they're hard to maintain at their highest peak. The human body, the human nervous system, can only be pushed so far. As Dr. Charles McMorran Wilson famously argued, a man's courage is his capital, and he is always spending. Officers should watch the expenditure of every penny lest their men go bankrupt. To avoid such bankruptcy, militaries have long sought the aid of pharmacology. Either explicitly or by permissiveness, military authorities have used substances to expand soldiers' combat performance, to combat stress, to mitigate trauma, and to relieve boredom. Now, traditionally, the most common of these substances, and this dates as far back as the hoplites in ancient Greece, the most common of these substances was alcohol. In his groundbreaking book Shooting Up, Professor Łukasz Kamienski argues that alcohol has entered into an almost symbiotic relationship with soldiering, playing four major roles in the history of warfare. Now, the first of these is medical. Alcohol was traditionally used to anesthetize wounds, to treat infections, and as a general cure-all. Apparently, it's equally effective for treating fevers as hypothermia. Building on this, its second role was as a battlefield stimulant, used to lower rates of stress and to raise courage. Inversely, alcohol's depressive qualities were also used to offer respite from trauma, often as a reward following fighting. This reward is physiological as well as psychological, as alcohol's fourth benefit is as an effective energy source. One bottle of wine provides nearly 700 calories, while a bottle of rum provides up to 4,000, enough to supply an adult male's energy requirements for 2 days. Just don't ask them to drive afterwards. Consequently, rum was liberally distributed to British troops during the First World War. A typical rum ration was 70 millilitres per man, a little over a double shot. Now, this doesn't sound a lot, but remember four things. One, this was taken neat. Two, soldiers would receive several rations a day. Three, army rum was 80% ABV. That's nearly double commercial strengths even today. And four, troops were often given double doses when going over the top. Indeed, the use of rum was so ubiquitous that in 1922, a former Blackwatch medical officer told an inquiry into shell shock that, had it not been for the rum ration, I don't think we'd have won the war. Put simply, fighting spirit apparently can be bottled. especially when we consider that these rations would have been supplemented by other sources of booze. And if you're interested in this topic, I can heartily recommend Adam Zietnik's excellent book, A Thirst for Wine and War. Now, this is all fine, but how does it apply to Tolkien's work? Well, to maintain reader interest, Tolkien doesn't really devote much narrative space to the discussion of supply lines. The issues mentioned in Book 3, when the reader learns that, even after being despoiled, the walls of Isengard have acres tilled by the slaves of Saruman, or, more explicitly in Book 6, when the narrator states that Frodo and Sam had no knowledge of the slave-worked farms in southern Mordor that supply Sauron's armies with food. The logistics of the Rohirric and Gondorian forces are even more nebulous. In Book 5, we get reference to a fair and fertile townland in the Ramas Echor, which seems to possess orchards, grain, and livestock. But we're given little sense of how this produce or provisions are. We're given little sense of how this produce is transported, merchandised, or stored. As such, we can't draw parallels with the medieval models of troop provision or with the kind of mechanized supply lines that Tolkien would have experienced in France, especially with relation to the movement of alcohol. We see wine being used in formal dinners in Minas Tirith and Edoras, but we never see quartermasters handing out fortifying drinks to the Guardians of Osgiliath, or see an Aered supping from their flasks. Based on Lick, then, the link between alcohol and army in Tolkien's work seems negligible. Job done. Presentation over. But let's not be too hasty to draw parallels. While the War of the Ring features enormous battles, Tolkien's narrative focus is often on small groups. In tactical terms, the Company of the Ring is actually an infiltration squad designed to operate in secrecy, not in battle, and this is taken from the US Army Maneuver Center of Excellence. This means that the supplies they had would be limited to what they can carry. This means that provisions would need to be carefully selected, and it's here that we need to discuss elven libations. Tolkien arguably drew on folk tales that show the creation and consumption of alcohol by the Fae. From The Hobbit, we learn that wood elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine, and of the efforts they seem to take to replenish the barrels and barrels and barrels in Thranduil's cellars. In fact, Silver elves seem so keen on wine that senior officials, like the king's butler and the chief of the guards, are willing to breach the king's private stash to reward themselves for their efforts. Here, note that the butler will be working hard tonight clearing the cellars of empty wood. Empty barrels, perhaps? You just have to wonder how much the elven nobility is actually planning to drink. However, by the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's elves are more elevated and enigmatic, as are their provisions. When the hobbits meet Gildor at the edge of the Shire, he doesn't supply the halflings with wine. Instead, they're given a fragrant draught, cool as a clear fountain, golden as a summer afternoon. Note the indirect nature of these similes, focusing on the impressions instead of flavours. And the fact that Sam can never describe in words nor picture clearly his experiences of that night enhance its mysterious nature. This mystery continues in chapter 12, when Glorfindel gives the travellers a liquor that was as clear as spring water and had no taste, but strength and vigour seemed to flow into all their limbs as they drank it. Here, we arguably see the first instance of alcohol or alcohol-adjacent beverages being used to revivify courage without deluding the mind. It won't be the last. More significantly, I contend, is the use of Miravor in Book 2. Introduced during the attempt to scale Caradas, Gandalf spares just a mouthful of the very precious cordial of Imladris, provided by Elrond for presumably such emergencies. Much like before, this drink is described chiefly by its effects. Its warmth and fragrance revive their hope and vigour, giving Frodo in particular new strength of heart. Indeed, the value of Miravor is emphasised in all its subsequent appearances. Now, if you look at these two quotes here, note the parsimony of the verb choices: spared, gave. These choices are made even more telling by the fact that in earlier drafts, this liquor was just one of Elrond's cordials, and the name Miravor did not appear. As such, Tolkien must have thought it important enough to introduce these additional details regarding the drink. So, what is Miravor, and why is it so precious? The problem here is that I've given you almost the entirety of its textual existence. This means that I'm forced to draw on additional sources, but I do think this side quest is worthwhile. Research into the Quenya lexicon suggests that Tolkien had invented the word as far back as 1915. Derived from the Gothic elements midu, meaning mead, and wopis, meaning sweet, Tolkien drew on Greek notions of ambrosia, the so-called nectar of the gods, when creating the concept of Miraval. as he later retconned this idea into one of Elrond's cordials. My argument here is that Miraval may be seen as a symbol of grace, which is to say, a positive intervention by divine powers into the mundane world. This notion of grace as an undeserved favour or the power of living can be seen on multiple occasions in the Bible, such as in Romans chapter 3, verse 24, where God's grace is referred to as a gift, or in Corinthians chapter 9, verse 8, where grace becomes a source of power to complete tasks. This mirrors the renewed hope and vigour given by Miraval, but why should its effects be seen as divine rather than mundane? Well, to answer that, we need to go back in time slightly. In 1967, Tolkien collaborated with Donald Swann to produce a book which set his poetry to sheet music. The additional notes given in the text state that Midavore, the liquor's precursor, was a drink of the Valar. It's made from a honey derived from the undying flowers in the gardens of Yavanna and was served at their festivals. The Middle-earth equivalent may simply be named in its honour, but Tolkien's broader corpus suggests that something else may be occurring. In The Nature of Middle-earth, we learn that lembas, another Elvish provision, is made of western corn, a crop gifted to the Noldor by Manwë and Varda. This corn had special virtue, thus explaining the sustaining power of lembas bread. Now, I believe that this 1967 retcon is the result of a longer thought process on elven provisions. Specifically, in Letter 210, dated June 1958, Tolkien states to Forrest Ackerman that lembas would be chemically indistinguishable from other cakes of wheat meal. Therefore, its virtues are spiritual, even, to quote him here, what might one hesitantly call religious. Tolkien develops this tentative assertion in an October 1958 letter to Deborah Webster, in which he discusses the comparison of lembas to the Eucharist, linking it not just to sacramental bread, but to viacitum, that is, the Eucharist given to a person near or in danger of death. Despite being wary of analogy, Tolkien doesn't refute this interpretation. In fact, he could argue he endorses it, stating in Book 6 that without lembas, Frodo and Sam would have long ago laid down to die, as it fed their will and gave strength to endure beyond mortal capabilities. As Miraval has a similar effect in provenance, is it possible that we could draw a similar link between the domestic and the divine? Is it conceivable that a similar transfer of flora may have occurred from the gardens of Valinor to the valley of Rivendell, like the mallow nuts that travelled from Tolesera to Linden to Lothlorien? Expanding on its spiritual significance, if lembas is the body of the Eucharist, might we conceptualize Miraval as the blood, a communion in both senses of the word? Now, I hesitate to push this comparison further for want of further evidence. However, I will finish this section by noting that, in an essay in Unfinished Tales discussing Isildur's death, we learn that every Dunedain carried a small phial of cordial and wafers of away bread like the Midavore and lembas of the Eldar. If this combination wasn't beneficial, then why carry both? Are these substances designed to revivify body and soul? Now, voluntary revivification of troops is a desirable goal for any military, but sometimes the flesh needs further support. So now let's turn our attention from spirits to stimulants. These are defined as substances that enhance the activity of the nervous system and produce greater physical arousal. And typically in these days means use of either amphetamines or cocaine. Of these, cocaine was by far the dominant drug during World War I, not just for medical purposes, but for the enhancement of soldiers' performance, supplying physical energy and stimulating their fighting spirit. The British Army made extensive use in this period of a medicine sold under the brand name Force March. This drug contained cocaine and kola nut extract and was given to troops to allay hunger and prolong the power of endurance. Furthermore, research suggests that, on many occasions, combatants were not even told that they were being administered stimulants. Instead, so-called boosting powders would be mixed in with their rations, especially mixed in with their rum to maximize its effects. Now, as an officer, Tolkien may well have seen these stimulants being used or employed them himself. Without evidence, it's impossible to tell. However, their use is arguably echoed in the War of the Ring with the drafts used by Saruman's orcs, a negative, even forced version of pharmacological enhancement. At the beginning of Book 3, Merry and Pippin struggle to keep up with their Isengard captors. To maintain the pace, Ugluk, leader of the orc group, force feeds the hobbits a burning liquid that fills them with a fierce glow and numbs their wounds and gives them extra energy. Now, note the difference between this draft and their elven equivalents. Midavore and its ilk renew not just physical strength, but vigor, that is to say, energy, effort, and enthusiasm. To recap my earlier point, these drinks seem to replenish the body and the spirit. Now contrast this with the orc draught. This is purely mundane, concerned with forcing flesh past its accustomed limits. We see this later when Pippin realizes that he can maintain the pace of the orcs due to the power of the orc liquor. The contrast between the two draughts is made even more explicit when Merry compares the wholesome energy of elven provisions with the heat of the orc draught, reflecting this better not to know what it's made of. Sensible suggestion, Merry. After their escape and meeting with Treebid in Chapter 4, the hobbits learn about Saruman and his orc breeding program. We're told that Saruman has a mind of metal and wheels, who does not care for growing things except as far as they serve him. Tolkien never discloses the specifics of Saruman's special breeding methods, but for someone with Saruman's mechanistic mindset, it's reasonable to infer that he might have used artificial methods to grow his forces. Now, this was made explicit in the Peter Jackson adaptation, with the orcs being shown emerging from birthing pits, thereby depicting just one of the explanations that Tolkien proposed for orc creation and procreation. At the very least, it's reasonable to assume that Saruman would have no qualms about supplying his forces with artificial stimulants. Remember, we never see similar draughts being used by the orcs of Mordor or the orcs of the Misty Mountains. Saruman the White, indeed. Based on these suppositions, I'd like to share an interpretation. If we assume a shared unnaturalness or perversion between Saruman's orcs and their draughts, could we see a similar provision or inversion of the Eucharist being symbolized with Miraval? For Christians, the Eucharist symbolizes spiritual nourishment, symbolizing a love of Christ and his gift of eternal life for humanity through his sacrifice. In John chapter 6, verse 51, Jesus states, "This bread is my flesh, and I will give for the life of the world." Put another way, Jesus offers himself to serve others. Arguably, Saruman is actually saying the reverse. He gives his unnatural servants unnatural means to complete his orders. In other words, he expects them to take up themselves to serve him. To paraphrase Frodo in Book 6, when attempting to create evil forces in Middle-earth can only mock, they can't make. Now, there's a quick disclaimer here. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't want to push this interpretation too far. It just struck me as an interesting parallel. Please make of it what you will. Okay, so let's recap so far. We've seen how substances can be used to lessen pain, to increase energy, and to revivify combatants' courage. Therefore, we've met some of the criteria that we mentioned previously. However, thus far, these substances have been administered by those in authority, either benevolently or brutishly. So what about voluntary self-medication with substances? Now, for this, I contend we need to focus on hobbits and beer. Specifically, the use of beer not just as a substance, but as a symbol for belonging. Now, as we saw earlier, self-medication can involve sublimating unpleasant experiences, but that's not true in every case. For others, relief comes from community. Maslow's 1954 hierarchy of needs suggests that physical and social needs are closely entwined, with community participation nearly as important to individual well-being as personal protection. Now, recent research seems to corroborate Maslow's assertions, with social isolation in the modern world correlated with individuals experiencing increased rates of cancer, higher levels of stress hormones like cortisol, and hypervigilance to social threats, excessive vigilance to social threats. Now, to mitigate these effects, Johann Hari argues, we need to feel that we're sharing something meaningful with others, and it's here that the link with alcohol becomes apparent. To paraphrase Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychiatrist at Oxford University, the main benefit of alcohol is social, facilitating interpersonal bonding and community cohesion. This is a link that Tolkien himself understood and embraced. The professor's letters imply that he was a frequent visitor to the Mitre pub and its more famous counterpart, the Eagle and Child pub on St Giles Street. When these were not available, he'd find alternative venues, such as the White Horse, or help himself from his own beer supply, which he had bought in by the barrel. The crucial detail here is how he drank. While expressing admiration for the noble art of brewing, as you can see here, Tolkien was as motivated by companionship as quaffing. In August 1944, he wrote that without regular drinks with his friends, life would be as bright as water in a ditch, And in September of that same year, he stated that when the war finishes, the Inklings will celebrate with a week of beer and talk. Now, this mindset is reflected in his depiction of the Shire. We learn that halflings drink often and heartily, up to 6 times a day. Furthermore, in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, we learn that Bag End and presumably other hobbit holes, they're well provisioned with barrels of beer and bottles of wine. Now, despite this personal supply, hobbit drinking is rarely solitary. Like Tolkien, they delight in communal consumption, and there is at least 12 pubs mentioned within the boundaries of the Shire. Now, tellingly, the first reference to beer in Lord of the Rings is almost also one of the first ever lines of dialogue from a hobbit, where it's equated with social currency. Proper conduct, according to Gaffer Gamgee, is equated with gifting a pint. Moreover, through the initial stages of the Hobbit's journey, beer is equated with civilization and comfort. Frodo's initial concerns about Farmer Maggot are allayed by a huge jug of good brew. Following terrifying encounters with Barrow-wights, Nazgul, and killer trees, a meal in Bree featuring good deep mugs of beer leaves the hobbits feeling refreshed and encouraged, despite the threats that are still facing them. This link between beer, bonhomie, and bravery continues throughout the text, even in extremis. Pippin is borne up by the hope of draught ale in the homes of the wise and courtly men, even after his interrogation by Denethor. During their privations in the Emon Wheel, Sam is buoyed up at the thought of sharing a mug, half a mug of beer with Frodo. Following the sacking of Isengard, Merry finds and then asks Gimli to share a very passable barrel of beer, even amidst the detritus of battle. Again and again and again, drinking and community are linked in Hobbit culture. In fact, this link is so strong that Saruman bans the sale and possession of beer, as soon as he assumes control of the Shire. However, note that Saruman allows his men to drink freely and permits, or based on his stores in Isengard likely encourages, his ruffians to hoard this confiscated ale. Based on this, the ban clearly has no moral imperative. Instead, the former wizard is attempting to prevent the formation of collective action against his takeover by controlling the flow of social lubricant. Indeed, after him being overthrown, beer becomes as much a symbol of liberty as libation, with the discovery of hidden beer stashes being seen as an apt reward for the heroic hobbit resistance. Okay, so let's draw to a close with a little bit of evaluation. In undertaking this research, I had to balance content with relevance. Earlier, we noted that smoking is a common self-medication strategy. As such, I could have included a discussion of pipeweed. If I had, I could have noted some notable examples, such as Gandalf's repeated desire for a smoke, even amidst the darkness and dangers of Moria. However, I felt that pipeweed's self-medicative properties were just too weak to warrant detailed discussion, and its community-building effects were similar to those of beer, so I'd just be repeating myself. Similarly, I could have mentioned ent drafts, but I chose not to due to their limited use in the text. So, based on the topics we've covered, can we reach any conclusions? Do combatants in Middle-earth use substances to bolster their courage? Well, simply, yes. But, as is often the case in Tolkien, it's the nuances that should grab our attention. As per Kamiansky's outline, alcohol and other stimulants are used to aid combatants during the War of the Ring. However, this assistance takes different forms. Saruman's uses focus on the flesh, with his orc drafts designed to reduce fatigue and to supply energy. Motivation, stress alleviation, perceptual acuity, all these themes seem to be afterthoughts. All that matters to Saruman is that his troops can travel swiftly and then physically dominate a given environment. In contrast, the elven cordials used by the Company of the Ring seem to target both body and spirit. Interestingly, their use is not correlated with sensory, emotional, or mental distortions. Users still see the situations they're in as they are, however challenging. What has been revived is their vigour or their strength of heart, not simply strength of limb. This revivification can be seen to possess spiritual, potentially even religious associations, but I leave that up to the individual reader to decide. On a more mundane level, the symbolic functions of alcohol appear equally effective in supplying strength. For hobbits, the existence of, and desire for, good quality ale is repeatedly correlated with community cohesion. Put simply, the interconnected processes required to produce beer symbolize stable, peaceful communities. To quote another Oxford man, Evelyn Waugh, in Another World War, I rejoiced in the Burgundy. It seemed a reminder that the world was an older and better place than Rex knew, that mankind in its long passion had learnt another wisdom than his. The bottle can indeed be used to heal the heart and drown the woes. For hobbits, beer is synonymous with belonging, and fellowship is always worth fighting for.